My name is Michael Reed. I'm 34 years old, and like most people, I've always thought the ghost stories my family told were just exaggerations. I grew up hearing my parents and grandmother talk about our basement as if it were some kind of off-limits zone, but to me it was just a damp, dark space full of old boxes. Nothing more. At least, that's what I thought. Last week, my parents went away to visit relatives, and I volunteered to take care of the house. The truth is, I hadn't spent much time there since I moved to the city. Everything felt too small, too old-fashioned, as if the house had been stuck in time. It was supposed to be a quiet week of nostalgia and silence, but what happened that night changed the way I see the world. I was sitting in the living room watching some documentary when I heard it for the first time. A low sound, like wood creaking under a weight. I ignored it, thinking it was just the old structure of the house reacting to the wind. But then another sound came, clearer this time. Something metallic, like a chain being dragged. I stopped the video and sat in silence, waiting. The sound came again, this time followed by a loud crack, almost like a slap against wood. Just the wind, I muttered to myself, trying to sound calm. But the wind shouldn't be coming from the basement. I looked down the hallway that led to the basement door. The overhead light was dim, casting long shadows on the walls. My chest felt heavy. It was just my imagination, wasn't it? I grabbed a flashlight and forced myself to walk to the door. Each step felt heavier, like something was pulling me back. I slowly opened the door. The smell of mold and old wood immediately rose up, along with an unexpected chill that seemed to envelop my feet. I turned on the flashlight and shone it on the wooden stairs leading down. Nothing but dust and shadows. "Let's get this over with," I said loudly, trying to calm my nerves. I walked down the creaking steps, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The basement was as it always was, filled with stacked cardboard boxes, old tools, and an old bookshelf my grandmother had used. But in the corner, near a dusty trunk, something caught my eye. A toy. It was a rusty red wind-up car I hadn't seen since I was 8 years old. It was out of place, standing in the center of a dust patch, as if it had just been placed there. I knelt down to pick it up, and that's when it happened. The car began to move. Without anyone touching it, the wheels turned with a soft metallic sound, and the car lurched forward a few inches. I dropped the toy as if it had been burned. My heart was pounding, and the cold in the basement seemed to have grown even more intense. And then I heard it. A low, hoarse voice whispered behind me. I couldn't make out the beginning, but the last sentence was clear as day. "Go back upstairs." I froze. My entire body went numb, but my survival instinct took over. I stood up so fast that I hit the bookshelf, knocking books to the floor. I ran to the stairs, each step creaking under my weight, and threw myself out of the basement. I slammed the door shut and leaned against it, breathing heavily. The silence returned, but now it was oppressive, heavy. My flashlight was pointed down the hallway, but I couldn't stop looking at the door behind me. It was as if something was still down there, waiting. That night was long. I tried to convince myself that I had imagined it all, but the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't go away. It wasn't just the toy. It wasn't just the voice. It was the fact that, for some reason, I was sure that the basement was warning me. And that warning was clear. After that night, I tried to convince myself that it was all just my imagination, a trick of the mind fueled by old stories and the loneliness of that house. But the truth is, I couldn't forget the sound of that voice. It wasn't an echo or something that could be attributed to the wind or the old plumbing system. It was something alive, something conscious. I spent the next day trying to keep myself busy. I cleaned the kitchen, organized the cabinets, anything to keep my mind off the basement. But the silence in the house was oppressive. I heard small sounds all the time, crackling in the walls, a soft rustling as if something were moving down there. I tried to ignore it, but the idea that something was in the basement consumed me. Around 8 that night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard it again. Footsteps. They were light, slow, and coming directly from the basement. My heart raced. I tried to convince myself that it was an animal, maybe a mouse or even a cat that had come in through the window. But deep down, I knew better. I grabbed my flashlight and approached the basement door. This time, it felt colder to the touch, almost freezing. I swallowed hard and turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing the darkness below. Whatever it is, I'll find out. I slowly descended, each step creaking under my weight. The smell of mold and rust was even stronger. When I reached the bottom, I swept the room with my flashlight. The basement looked the same: boxes, tools, dust. But the rope cart was gone. My chest tightened. I looked around, trying to find any sign of movement. It was then that I noticed something new. One of the boxes in the corner was open. I was sure it had been closed the night before. I approached slowly, my flashlight shaking in my hand. Inside the box were old photos, yellowed with age. I picked one up and felt a shiver run down my spine. It was a picture of the house, but something was wrong. At the basement window there was a shadowy figure, indistinct but clearly human. Suddenly a loud sound behind me broke the silence. I turned sharply and saw that the old bookshelf had fallen to the floor, scattering books and dust everywhere. My flashlight began to flicker and the cold in the room became almost unbearable. It was then that I heard it again. "I told you so." The hoarse, low voice came from the darkest corner of the basement. The flashlight blinked one last time before going out completely. My heart was beating so fast that I thought I would faint. I tried to move, but my body was paralyzed. Something began to emerge from the darkness, a shapeless shadow, tall and irregular, that seemed to expand and pulsate. Two bright spots appeared where its eyes should have been, fixed on me. The sound of heavy breathing filled the room. I knew I had to get out of there. With all the strength I could muster, I ran toward the stairs. I stumbled on the first few steps, but kept going, my mind screaming at me not to look back. When I reached the door, I slammed it hard, knocking the flashlight to the floor. I closed the door behind me and locked it. From the other side, I heard a soft sound, like nails scraping on wood. Then, silence. I spent the rest of the night in the living room, with all the lights on. I didn't sleep a wink. In the morning, I packed up my things and left the house, leaving a note for my parents saying I couldn't stay any longer. I never told them what had happened. I didn't want them to think I was crazy, and maybe it was better if they didn't know what was really in the basement. A few weeks later, I got a call from my mom. She asked if I had gone through the boxes in the basement, because she had found some of them out of place. She said she had also heard footsteps last night, and that the wind-up toy car I hadn't seen since I was a child was in the center of the room, as if someone had put it there. I told her never to go down to the basement again, but deep down, I know that won't solve anything. Whatever's down there, it won't stop. And even today, on very quiet nights, I hear that hoarse voice in my dreams, always repeating the same thing: go back upstairs. My name is Thomas Kane, and I've never considered myself an impressionable person. In my job, traveling from town to town selling farm equipment, you get used to isolation and silence. Long drives, quick stops, a hot cup of coffee in the wee hours of the morning. That was my routine. But that night something changed, something I've never been able to explain. I was driving down Route 50, a desolate stretch of highway in the middle of the Nevada desert. They call it the loneliest road in America, and rightly so. All I saw for hours were sand dunes, distant mountains, and a dark sky dotted with stars. There were no signs, no cars, not even streetlights. Just me, my car, and that endless stretch of asphalt. The clock on the dashboard read 11:47 p.m., and I still had many miles to go before I reached Carson City. I turned on the radio to ward off sleep, but all I heard was static. I shrugged, turned off the radio, and turned up the air conditioning to keep my mind alert. It was then that I noticed it for the first time. To the right of the road, I saw a broken sign, tilted, its words faded by time. I passed it without thinking much, but a few minutes later I saw it again. The same sign, in the same condition with the same tilt. There must be more than one around here, I muttered to myself, trying to justify it. But then I started paying more attention. Soon, another detail caught my attention. A dead tree, its dry branches twisted like fingers pointing to the sky. I passed the tree again, then again and again. My stomach churned as I realized that I was seeing the same landmarks over and over, even though I was driving in a straight line. Sweat began to run down my back, despite the cool air in the car. I decided to test something. When I saw the sign again, I looked at the dashboard and wrote down the mileage. I kept driving for 10 minutes. When the sign appeared again, the mileage had not changed. It was as if time had stopped. I pulled over to the side of the road, my heart pounding. The silence of the desert was oppressive, broken only by the sound of the engine. I got out of the car and took a deep breath, looking around. The road was empty, no lights, no signs of life. The moon cast long, unsettling shadows across the sand. That was when I saw him for the first time. Ahead, on the side of the road, was a human figure. He stood motionless, wearing a hat and a long coat that blended into the shadows. The distance made details indistinct, but there was something about him that chilled me to the bone. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out, my voice sounding small in the vast silence of the desert. The figure didn't respond. He stood completely still, like a statue. Something inside me screamed to get back in the car, but curiosity pushed me to take a few steps toward him. As I got closer, he slowly turned his face. His eyes were coal black, shining with an impossible glare in the moonlight. I tried to run, but my legs felt stuck to the ground. The figure didn't move, but its presence seemed to grow, as if the road itself were conspiring to trap me there. Finally, I managed to break free and ran back to the car. I jumped in the cab, slammed the door, and sped off without looking back. The speedometer climbed as I drove with my foot pressed hard on the accelerator. Sweat dripped down my forehead, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. After a while, I began to calm down. The man was behind me. I was safe. Or at least I thought I was. A few minutes later, I saw the broken sign again. The dead tree appeared soon after. And then, at the side of the road, the figure was there again. But now closer, with its head tilted as if watching me. My heart raced. I knew I was trapped. Something on this road wanted me there, and the man's presence only made that clearer. I drove until the gas tank began to empty. I had to make a choice. Stop and confront whatever it was, or keep driving, hoping the road would set me free. But deep down, I knew the truth. The road had no intention of letting me go. The car's engine began to stall. It was almost out of gas, and the road kept repeating itself endlessly. The same broken sign, the dead tree, and finally, the black-eyed man appeared again, this time in the middle of the road. I slowed down, stopping a few feet away from him. I didn't know what to do. Every part of my instinct screamed at me not to get out of the car, but the feeling of being trapped gnawed at me from within. I took a deep breath, slowly opening the door, my eyes fixed on the still figure. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice echoing in the void. He didn't answer. He just raised an arm, pointing ahead toward what seemed to be a fork in the road, something I hadn't seen before. To the left, a path disappeared into a thick, pulsing fog. To the right, the familiar road continued, clearly leading to the same loop that had trapped me. The figure finally spoke, his voice low and deep like distant thunder. "Choose." My heart raced. I knew that continuing down the right-hand road meant more of the same cycle, the same despair. The fog to the left seemed like a crazy gamble, but it was my only chance. I stared at the figure, hoping for more guidance, but it disappeared before my eyes, dissolving like smoke. I got in the car and turned the steering wheel to the left. The fog swallowed the car immediately. The sound of the engine was muffled, and the light from the headlights seemed to penetrate no more than a few feet ahead. My chest tightened as I continued driving, trying to ignore the feeling that I was moving into the absolute unknown. The road began to change. There was no more asphalt, just a dirt track surrounded by twisted trees. The car radio turned on by itself, emitting disturbing static. Amid the hiss, a familiar voice whispered, "Keep going. You're close." I wanted to stop, but something in that voice gave me courage. I kept driving, sweat dripping down my face. Time seemed to disappear, but then, suddenly the fog began to lift. I saw flashing lights ahead, not headlights, but a traffic signal. When I emerged from the fog, I found myself at an intersection. Ahead was a sign, "Welcome to Carson City." I couldn't believe it. I had to pull over and take a deep breath. The clock on the dashboard changed for the first time, showing 12:03 a.m. Time had moved on. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the black-eyed figure or the endless road behind me. But there was only the quiet desert. The sound of the crickets and the fresh air filled me with relief. I was free. Later that night, I arrived at my hotel in Carson City. I didn't sleep, of course. I stared out the window, waiting for something to appear in the darkness. But nothing happened. In the morning, I went to a convenience store to buy a coffee, and while I was at the checkout, I noticed an old newspaper on a shelf. On the front page was a photo of Route 50 and the headline, "Cursed Road, Reports of Mysterious Disappearances." I read the article, which mentioned missing drivers and legends about a shadowy figure who tested the souls of travelers. Next to the article was a grainy photo of the man in the coat and hat. My fingers trembled as I put the newspaper back down. I had survived. Somehow I had managed to escape. But the road was still there, waiting for another traveler to test it. As I left the store and walked back to my car, I looked out at the horizon and saw the peaceful desert stretching out before me. But in the back of my mind, I knew I would never be completely free. The road was a part of me now, like an invisible scar that would never fade. My name is Jack Mason, and I've been driving trucks across the United States for 15 years. I've seen a lot of strange things on the road, bizarre accidents, creatures that appear out of nowhere, even people standing alone in the middle of nowhere. But nothing prepared me for what happened that night on Route 66. It was a quiet early morning. The sky was clear, and the stars shone like millions of points of light in the vast desert around me. I was on my way to Kingman, Arizona, to deliver a load of appliances. There were no cars or towns in sight, just the roar of the engine and the soft sound of the radio playing an old country classic. Around 2 in the morning, my phone rang. I looked at the display, unknown number. I thought it was odd, but I answered it, thinking it might be something related to the delivery. "Hello?" My voice broke the silence. On the other end of the line, I heard a soft cry. It was a woman. Her breathing labored, as if she were afraid. "Please, help me," she whispered. Her voice was shaking, barely audible. "Who are you? What's going on?" I asked, trying to sound calm. She kept talking, but her words were mixed with a staticky sound. I could only make out a few sentences. "I'm in the house. He's here. Please." Before I could ask more, the line went dead, leaving only silence. I looked at the phone, expecting her to call back, but nothing happened. My mind started to spin. Who was she? Was she in danger? And where was this house? I sighed, trying to convince myself that it was some kind of mistake or prank. I turned the radio back on, adjusting the volume to drown out the discomfort. But a few minutes later, I saw something on the side of the road. It was an old house. The description of it matched what the woman had said immediately. Broken windows, a half-open door swinging in the wind, and a wooden sign lying in the front yard. The discomfort turned into a knot in my stomach. I slowed down and parked the truck. I sat there for a few seconds, staring at the house. Something felt wrong. It wasn't just the fact that I was out there in the middle of nowhere. It was the feeling that I shouldn't be getting any closer. But curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed out of the truck. The air was still, almost suffocating. The desert sand crunched under my boots as I walked toward the house. The door creaked slightly as if it had been waiting for me to arrive. "Hello? Is anyone there?" I called, my voice echoing through the empty structure. The inside of the house was even worse than I had imagined. Old broken furniture was scattered about, covered in dust. The walls had deep scratch marks, as if something had scratched them. In the center of the room sat an old radio, with large knobs and a lighted dial. Suddenly, footsteps sounded upstairs. My flashlight shook in my hand as I pointed it toward the stairs. "It's okay. I'm here to help," I said, climbing the stairs slowly. The second floor was even darker. I entered a small room where I found the radio I had seen earlier. It was no longer in the room. It was now there, in the middle of a dust-covered table. The dial blinked, emitting a dim light. As I approached, the radio began to hiss. The same female voice that had called me echoed from the receiver. "He's coming. You need to leave." My heart raced. I turned to leave the room, but the door slammed shut on its own. I tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Behind me, the static from the radio grew louder, as if something was approaching. And then I heard a low, guttural laugh. It wasn't the woman's voice. It was something different. I turned slowly. In the dark hallway, a tall, shapeless shadow began to emerge. She seemed to float. Her outlines blurred, but her eyes glowed red. The static on the radio turned into a scream. "Run!" Instinct took over. I threw myself against the door, which gave way with a loud creak. I ran up the stairs, nearly tripping on the steps, and out the front door. Behind me, I heard the laughter grow louder, echoing through the night. As I climbed into the truck and slammed the door, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The house seemed even darker, and the shadow was standing in the doorway watching me. I started the truck and sped away, leaving the house behind. But even as I drove away, the feeling that something was still following me didn't go away. I sped down the deserted road, trying to forget the sight of the house in the shadow. But no matter how far I drove, the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. The truck's radio was off, but it still emitted a low hiss, like residual static. My heart was beating so fast it seemed to echo inside the cabin. I glanced in the rearview mirror several times, expecting to see the shadow following me. The desert seemed empty, but the darkness around it was oppressive, as if something was hiding, just waiting for the right moment to appear. It was then that the radio turned on by itself. "Jack." The voice was the same as before, soft and shaky, but now it sounded clearer, almost desperate. My throat went dry. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" I asked, as if the voice could hear me. "He's hunting you. Don't look back," the voice whispered before being swallowed by the static. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, but I kept driving, my eyes fixed on the road. The clock on the dashboard read 3:15 a.m., but it felt like time had frozen. There was no end to that road. There were no lights on the horizon, no signs indicating nearby cities. Just the same endless strip of asphalt. That was when the shadow appeared again. It was in the middle of the road, a few meters ahead. Its red eyes glowed, fixed on me. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding before coming to a complete stop. Silence filled the room, except for the sound of my heart pounding. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't turn around, and continuing forward meant facing that thing. That's when I heard it again. "Get out of the truck." The voice came from behind me, but I knew I shouldn't look. My fingers tightened on the steering wheel as the shadow began to move toward me, floating above the asphalt. A shiver ran down my spine. "Please let me go." "I didn't do anything," I screamed, my voice cracking with fear. The shadow stopped a few feet from the cabin. Even though it had no clear shape, I could feel the hatred radiating from it. Then the truck's radio emitted a loud sound, like a scream mixed with static. "Just keep going," the woman's voice said again. I gathered all the courage I had and started the truck. The shadow remained motionless as I accelerated. My headlights passed right by it, as if it were made of smoke. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see it following me, but it had disappeared. For a few minutes, I thought I was free. The road began to change. The sides were covered in a thick fog that seemed to move, almost alive. The radio turned on again, but this time it was just static. My chest felt heavy, and the cabin felt colder, as if something had gotten in there with me. Looking at the dashboard, I noticed something strange. The clock had gone back to 3:15. No matter how long I drove, the time didn't change. It was like time was stuck. Finally, I saw a light on the horizon. It was dim, but enough to give me hope. I stepped on the gas, driving toward it. As I got closer, I realized it was a gas station, lit by a blinking neon sign. I parked the truck and quickly got out, feeling the cool night air. I looked around, expecting to see the shadow, but the desert was empty. The station radio played soft music, and the sound of footsteps on the gravel made me turn around. An elderly man in dirty overalls stood in the doorway of the convenience store, watching me curiously. "You okay, son? You look like you saw a ghost," he said with a tired smile. I glanced at my truck's radio, which was still emitting a faint static. I took a deep breath before answering. "Have you ever heard of a house around here? An old house with broken windows and a fallen sign?" The man's smile faded. He stared at me for a moment before answering, "Son, there's no house around here. Just desert. You must be imagining things." I tried to protest, but he shook his head. I pulled out my phone to show him the call I'd received, but the record was gone, as if it had never existed. That night, I continued my journey, trying to forget what had happened. But as I drove, something caught my attention. On the passenger seat was a small portable radio that I had never seen before. When I turned it on, the female voice whispered once more, "Thank you. You got away. But he's still around." The radio turned off by itself and my throat tightened. I knew there was something else on that road, something that could not be explained. I was free, but Route 66 doesn't forget easily, and it always finds someone to call.